Welcome and thank you for being here. I'm excited to introduce our speaker this morning. Dr. Michelle Grocke Dewey is the Assistant Professor in Human Development and Community Health, and she is also the Extension Health and Wellness Specialist. So she works with folks across the state in the areas of health and wellness. So Michelle, thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Katie, and good morning, everyone. Katie, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me and see me okay? Great. All right, well, thanks everyone for tuning in. I know it's early. Today, I'm going to be talking about managing the emotions of conflict. So this is I think, a really nice session right on the heels of Katie's session and Ashley Kent's, where last week, for those of you that were able to join us, we learned how to better cultivate our own self-awareness. And today we're going to take it a step further and explore the emotions that oftentimes come with conflict. And towards the end of the 20 minutes, I will share a couple of tips and tricks and strategies to help us better manage our emotions. But before we dive into the strategies, let's take a couple of minutes and define what emotions are and dive into that a little bit deeper. So hold on, let me advance here. All right, so what are emotions? I think it's really important to recognize that emotions are symptoms of complex cognitive function that we as humans engage in on a day-to-day basis. So that's not to say that other species don't have the capacity for emotions, but the way that humans have and can feel and experience emotions is quite complex and involves three distinct components. So as you'll see here on the slide, every emotion has a subjective experience, and we'll go into all these in a bit more detail. It has a physiological response, and it also then, that third part, is a behavioral or expressive response. And that's the part we can really work with when we're talking about conflict management. So we'll get to that last bit. Some of you might be thinking, well, what's the difference between an emotion and a feeling? Well, because there's the physiological and the behavioral change that's a fundamental aspect of emotions, emotions therefore can't simply be interpreted as feelings or mental states. Rather, feelings are the social, cultural, and individual interpretation of those emotions that are largely beyond our control. So in other words, feelings are how we interpret emotions and let them sink in. And we use the word feel for both physical and emotional states. So before we dive into these three components a little bit more, I want to talk about how emotions have been classified over the years and how we tend to classify them now. So this all started way back when, in the early 70s, psychologist Paul Ekman was the first one to sort of classify our emotions. And he first said, okay, throughout human cultures worldwide, there are six basic emotions: fear, disgust, anger, surprise, joy, and sadness. And later, as you can see on the slide, in 1999, he expanded his list to include a couple other things like embarrassment and pride and satisfaction. But in the meantime, a scholar by the name of Robert Plutchik, who's a psychologist as well, came up with what you might have heard of before, but the Wheel of Emotions. So this was published in 1980. You can see on the right, this model is often interpreted as a 3D depiction. And then on the left, if you were to sort of open that wheel, it kind of looks like this flower, this beautiful flower on the left here, with multiple colors and multiple emotions labeled. And so he came up with this to not only define emotions, but to really dive into how emotions are related to one another. So Plutchik suggested 8 primary emotional dimensions, which you see on the screen here. And you'll see that a lot of these are in opposition to one another. So joy and sadness, hopefully you can see my mouse, disgust and trust, anticipation and surprise, anger and fear. And you'll see that the lighter the color, so the outside of the wheel, the lesser the emotion. So the easier it is to control. As you kind of come towards the inside here, these are these really deep emotions that often become difficult to control or to deal with. So I guess from the inside out, intense emotions going to lesser emotions, and then you can kind of see the dichotomy of these and how they're all interrelated. All right, so let's go back and talk about this definition again now that we've had sort of that classification under our belt and how we can refer back to it. So back to our definition, emotions are complex psychological states that involve these three distinct components. And the first one is a subjective experience. So if you think about it, all emotions that we feel begin with something that happened. Maybe it was a conversation or a stimulus in the environment, or somebody said something, right? That stimulus triggers it, but it is a subjective experience. And the reason is that even though all those basic emotions that we just went over in Plutchik's wheel are expressed by all individuals, regardless of race, ethnicity, age, gender, the experience that produces them can be highly subjective and dependent on a lot of things. Also, although we can label emotions such as angry or happy, most of these exist in a pretty multidimensional, hence subjective way. I mean, think about a time that you were angry. I mean, was it really just anger, or was there maybe a little bit of nervousness or a little bit of frustration built in, right? So we don't always experience pure forms of each emotion. And so that's why it gets really difficult to kind of manage this. And I think it's important to spend a little bit of time here on the definition. So moving from that subjective piece, the next thing is a physiological response. And so there are a lot of theories of emotion, and they can really be grouped into three main categories. So the physiological theories, most of these talk about responses within the body are responsible for emotions. Then there's the neurological theories. These really are all centered on activity within the brain that leads to emotional responses. And then we have our cognitive theories that argue that thoughts and other mental activities play an essential role in forming emotions. So the three here on the screen on these slides are, I think, worth going over. All of these are a little bit different in terms of the order of operation. So what's happening first to then spur the emotion? So this first one, again, if you see the dog here, the James Lange hypothesis, that essentially states that our emotions happen according to our physiological response to an event. So for instance, assume you're taking a stroll in the woods and you happen upon a grizzly bear. So your fight or flight response becomes activated. You'll most likely start to tremble and your heart will start to race. So this hypothesis suggests that you'll decipher your physical response and presume you're panicked. So I am trembling, accordingly, I am anxious. And as indicated by this hypothesis, you're not trembling since you're panicked. Rather, you feel panicked on the grounds that you're trembling. So the next one, the Cannon-Bard hypothesis, so this middle one here, this theory of emotion states that stimulating events such as the bear or maybe a conversation at work triggers both emotions and physical reactions at the same time. So for example, seeing the bear might prompt the feeling of fear, the emotional response, and the racing heartbeat, the physical reaction at the same time. And then now I want to move on to this last one. So the Shatner-Singer two-factor theory of emotion. And this is the one that kind of resonates with me, but this involves two key components: physical arousal and a cognitive label. So in other words, the experience of emotion involves first having some kind of physiological response, which the mind then identifies. So simply feeling arousal isn't enough. We must also identify the arousal to feel the emotion. All right, so that's sort of all the physiology, which we certainly could spend an entire hour talking about. But that next component of the emotion definition is the behavioral response, right? So actually expressing our emotions. So there's a couple of things going on here. So one is emotional contagion. I want to bring this up because this is a form of social contagion that involves the spontaneous spread of emotion. So let's say you're in a room and somebody gets really angry about something that was said. Emotional convergence can happen from one person to another, just like a virus, right? So they can be shared across individuals implicitly and explicitly, which is important to remember when we talk about, in the next 10 minutes of this, sort of ways to manage our emotions. Another important piece here are sociocultural norms. So there is some great research that came out of Stanford University that talks about how most people across the world want to feel more positive than negative. Yet, the emotions that cause a positive experience are shown to change between cultures. So, according to a recent study, the positive emotions that European Americans typically prefer were excitement and elation, whereas Chinese populations preferred calm and relaxation more. So, I am an anthropologist, and there is a little bit of cultural variation here and kind of cultural conditioning to how we experience a lot of these emotions, which is good to know when we talk about management. And also our behavioral response. So, really, this part of it is what we can control. The subjective experience, we don't have that much control over. The physiology, don't have that much control. But here, our reaction to that emotion is something that we can work on. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about now in the talk. So that brings me to this concept of emotional intelligence, which I'm sure you all have heard of. Emotional intelligence, the term was first coined in 1990 by researchers Mayer and Salavi, but was later popularized by Daniel Goldman. And there are a lot of definitions out there. The one I like to use is the ability to understand and manage your emotions, as well as recognize and influence the emotions of those around you. And emotional intelligence, I like this, this visual here because it really has 4 components. And we can work on all 4 of these components, and they're all intertwined. So the first one you'll see on the left here, these are things for the self, so self-awareness and self-management. So, and then the top bit here, this is awareness, so self-awareness, management, and then others, so our social awareness, our awareness of others, and then our relationship management. And so we'll go into each of these now, and I will provide a tip or a trick to help us with this emotional intelligence. All right, so the self-awareness tip number 1, take time to become more aware of your emotions. And now that we've talked about a definition and that Plutchik model, I mean, that's given you a little bit of kind of fodder maybe to think about this. But being aware of your own emotions can really help. So there's a couple of ways that we can do this, and there's kind of 4 things that I think are really helpful. So the first one is to notice and name your feelings. So to start, just notice how you feel as things happen. Say the name of the emotion or the feeling to yourself. So for example, you might feel proud, when you're done with a presentation, or proud when, you had a great day at work. Maybe it's disappointment if something doesn't go your way, but simply recognizing and naming that emotion can help put a little bit of distance between you and that. The next thing is emotion tracking. So this is a fun exercise to do. And you can pick a different emotion every week. So let's say this week you pick the emotion like feeling glad. So track it all day. Notice how often you feel it. Maybe you're glad when something good happens, or glad when a friend shows up to your office with a coffee, or when somebody says a kind word to you, randomly in the hallway. Maybe you're glad just because it's Friday. But every time you're glad, make a mental note to yourself and write it down. And then also you can start to kind of identify, is it a mild emotion? Is it medium, or is it strong? Learn new words for feelings or emotions. So how many emotion words can you name? Try to think of even more, right? Like how many more are there words for angry? So for example, if you do this exercise a lot, you might say, okay, aside from just being angry, I'm annoyed, upset, I'm mad, I'm irate, fuming, outraged, right? So kind of play with being able to identify these emotions that you're feeling. You can keep a feelings journal. This is really helpful. Taking a few minutes each day to write about not only how you feel, but why, right? Writing about your feelings helps you to get to know them better, helps you associate those subjective experiences, your physiological response, and the emotions that it provokes. All right, the next piece of this kind of self-awareness, this is a wonderful assessment that was produced by scholars led by Dr. David at Harvard Medical School. And it's very quick, it's 5 minutes, and it's an emotional agility assessment to kind of help you navigate which of those Plutchik emotions are really difficult for you to manage and which ones are easier. And again, a lot of this is conditioned by our upbringing and our experience and our culture. So this is something I also recommend doing if you have a little bit of free time where you want to explore that self-awareness piece. All right, so moving back to our quadrant here, now we're going to go down to the self-management, so the self-action. So a tip here is to, like we talked about before, but to acknowledge and label your feelings. So to distance yourself from a feeling, you label it in the moment, right? Call it a thought, an emotion, an emotion. So next time you're in a meeting and maybe you're really disappointed that somebody didn't call out some good work that you did, instead of just kind of getting angry and letting that physiological response take over, take a moment and label it and say, I'm disappointed. I mean, to yourself, right? That this happened. The very act of labeling it and the conscious effort it requires gives you a little bit of distance from that. And then it can really activate that prefrontal cortex. So you can think rationally about, okay, I'm feeling this, but we're going to let that pass, and move on. So if you're in a conversation, for example, and you're talking to someone and you don't really agree with what they're saying, instead of saying, oh, she's so wrong about that and it's making me mad, you could shift that to say, I'm having the thought that my coworker is wrong and I'm feeling anger. Situation, thought, feeling. So labeling allows you to see your thoughts and feelings for what they are, transient sources of data that may or may not prove helpful. All right, another one is taking a break. And this is actually taking a break when conflict, gets a little bit heated or when you find yourself with a lot of emotions that are difficult to handle. So the more time, like we keep talking about, the more time you give yourself to process emotions, the less intense they're likely to be. So back to that Plutchik wheel, it'll likely kind of fizzle out to those outer rings with time. So again, reactions tend to be automatic, and we're trying to give ourselves some space from the feeling of the emotion to the reaction. So here's a scenario. So let's say you're in a conversation with a couple of colleagues and you start to feel intense emotions. Give yourself a neutral reason for why you want to pause the conversation. Say something like, and I promise you I've done this multiple times, like, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I'd love to get a quick cup of coffee before we continue. Can I get you something while I'm up? In that time, right, those pieces of emotion, right, the subjective event, the physiological response, and the action, the reaction will take place, but you're giving yourself more time to process, to label the emotion. During your break, I mean, Ashley led us through some great breathing exercises last week. During that break, do a quick body scan, check in with yourself. Another strategy used a lot in emotional regulation is visualization. So visualize your coworker's words going over your shoulder, not hitting you in the chest, right? And take a little bit of time, take that break to then come back, collect yourself, and you will be able, again, like I said, to distance yourself a bit from what caused that emotional reaction. All right, now we're going to go over to this quadrant where other people are involved, which is a very, everything we just talked about was very self-awareness, self-management. So now incorporating others, a very important part of emotional intelligence. So that a social awareness piece. So a lot of this social awareness has to do with our ability to practice empathy and our ability, this can continue through life, right? Our ability to become more empathetic towards others. So again, keeping in mind that understanding others' emotions and considering their perspectives are as important to creating fair, trustworthy work environments, home environments, etc. So we think about empathy. The definition I like is the ability to sense or understand the feelings of others, as well as the ability to imagine what somebody else might be thinking or feeling without them saying it. So some tips to improve your empathy skills are to lead with listening, right? We've talked a lot about this in the series, but to go into a conversation with an open ear, listening to the other person's perspective and not thinking of any conversation as a win-lose outcome, right? You're there to learn, to understand, not necessarily take the other person's side, but to understand where they're coming from. Asking questions to clarify so that you truly understand. Acknowledge the feelings that you're witnessing. So it seems like you're upset about something that happened, with the report. Can you elaborate, or can you let me know what, might make you feel otherwise? Research by Schumann and Saki shows that the desire to grow in empathy can be a driver in cultivating it. So your very willingness to grow in empathy is a great starting point. People can extend empathetic effort, like asking questions, listening longer to responses in situations where they feel different than someone, primarily if they believe empathy could be developed with effort. And then lastly is check in to restate what the other person is stating. This is really helpful in building empathy between people. I'm hearing that you're saying X, and letting that person respond. All right, lastly is our relationship management. So there are a lot of tips here. The one that I wanted to share in my last minute with everybody is kind of, if you've had a conflict and if things have not gone well, that doesn't mean that you should stop nurturing healthy relationship. There's always a good time to kind of come back around and say, okay, this meeting, ended in, a lot of emotions. Let's come back to it in order to nurture relationships with our coworkers, with our families, with our friends. So really, we can think of rebuilding the social fabric through micro moments. So research says that 17 micro moments with another person post-conflict is sort of on average what that person might need to say, you know what, like, let's keep that in the past and let's move on. So little things like asking someone, hey, how's your day going today? I know we had something happen last week, but let's move forward and really work on that relationship management. I heard you had a great presentation. Nice job. Right. So after the conflict, it's not just all said and done, but that's really when we hone in on this relationship management piece of that emotional intelligence. So friendliness with a purpose is sort of what I like to call it. So again, instead of removing yourself from the situation post-conflict, kind of going back at that and saying, okay, now it's time to rebuild. And these micro moments are a great way to do so. All right, so those are tips for all the emotional intelligence quadrants, with a little bit of diving into what emotions are and how we can, better think about them for conflict management. Thanks, Katie.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michelle. That was a lot of information packed in to 20 minutes. Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions here. The example you gave about getting up to get a cup of coffee and asking if the other person needs something from stepping away, from that emotional heated moment. Tracy had the question, can this make the person even more mad, and thinking like it could seem dismissive, um, without actually like naming this conversation is getting intense. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think some of these tips are, they're great starting points. I have had that go both ways, and I think it's about sort of reading the room, right? I mean, I've been in a situation where things have gotten really heated, and it was okay for me to say, you know what, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. I'll be right back, and we can continue the conversation. I mean, maybe it's about tone, right, and delivery, but I don't think, in some situations it may be, and it's always okay to say how you're feeling and what you need, right? So to say, you know what, I just need to take a minute. I respect everything that you're saying. I'm going to go to the break room, get a cup of coffee. Can I get you anything? And when I come back, I'd love to continue, right? I mean, I do think that a lot of it is tone, delivery, assessing the context. But I think knowing that you can take a break, right? Knowing that you can take a break even in a meeting is a nice tool, right? Or a nice out. Say, okay, that's a card that I might play if this gets a little bit intense and heated.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Some good questions coming in. Can emotions be based on personal cultural experiences?
Yes, so much so. And I know 20 minutes, it's hard to get into a lot of theory there, but I mean, when we talked about the response there, a lot of our response to it, things can trigger one person that don't trigger another person based on, their upbringing or their history or something that might have happened to them in the past. Right. And so that wheel is kind of important to understand in that self-assessment because it'll help you recognize what are those kind of triggering emotions for me. And whoever asked that question is spot on that a lot of that is our own cultural conditioning, where we grew up, things that have happened to us. So also in terms of emotional intelligence, if you can handle an emotion fine, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other person might, right? Because they have an entirely different history, upbringing, culture, etc.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. That this is like a dynamic, moving system with humans in it that can be messy, right? So, I love how you shared that answer. It's contextually, it depends, and situationally, and all the things. Another question. A mentor once told someone that to assume no malice and emotional conflict, yet it seems like our society does the opposite, assume malice and take a defensive approach. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I debated whether throwing in a lot of like the theory and the definition into this, but I think when we start thinking about emotional um, management, right? And I think it's so important to understand where emotions come from and how a lot of that is beyond our control. It's a product of us as humans wherever we are in our life, right? Everyone who's come before us has some impact on that, all of those stimuli. And I do think that understanding that really helps to reduce the stigma of emotional tension, right? Because if we understand that, I think it helps us relate to other people. Wow, something that was said in this meeting really brought up something for that person. And it may have nothing to do with this meeting, but maybe it's something 10 years back that they experienced. So I very much agree with that comment. And I do think one way to kind of backpedal or to maybe move forward from that is to really understand where emotions come from, what they're a product of, understand their complexity. And I think that allows us to be a lot more empathetic with others. Give them more grace, understand where they're coming from, lead with questions rather than trying to, especially in a work meeting, go in trying to win.
Yeah. Uh, is it a problem to have too much or too little in each quadrant in the emotional intelligence framework?
Goodness, no. I mean, I don't think there's a problem at all. I mean, I think it's really important to know that there are four quadrants, right? A lot of times folks might think, oh, emotional intelligence, that's all about, me and regulating my emotional response. No. Recognizing that there's a social component, there's an awareness and a management component. And then, a little bit of check-in. Okay, I'm really good here, but maybe that sort of rebuild the social fabric, that's something I can focus on. So I would say, I would bet most people are stronger in some than others, but identifying maybe the one that could use a little work and putting some time in, I think would benefit not only you, but those around you.
Okay, we're going to sneak one more question in here, even though it's top of the hour. When emotional intelligence increases, does rational thinking decrease? Or to restate that, as emotions increase, does rational thinking decrease? So I'm guessing this is more about emotions, not emotional intelligence.
Okay, yes. So basically, when we're in that physiological, right, we threw a bunch of theories out there, but that's your fight or flight, your like reptilian brain that's kind of taking over. And if you increase your emotional intelligence, you can kind of step away from that emotion. You label it, right? You label it, you give yourself a little bit of distance. By doing that and not just reacting, you're activating that prefrontal cortex, right? And you're moving more into rational thought. So I think that was the question, right? By increasing our emotional intelligence, we are actually able to control a lot of that behavior, that third component of emotions, which is pretty exciting, right? So, what are the things you need to do to kind of take a minute, understand it's your reptilian brain, your fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and now engaging that other part of your brain where you can think more rationally about, okay, I'm feeling that because of this experience. I'm going to shift it and react differently.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you all for being here. This was very helpful. This recording will be up in a couple days. If you want to go back and see some of the great theory and research Michelle was sharing, a nice segue into having some deeper emotional understanding is then establishing boundaries and accountability. So I hope you'll join us here next week. Caitlin Anderson will be on tap to give some strategies and tips around those two areas. So have a lovely day, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you.